Hi, today we're talking about our stained glass project. We've got all of the stained glass and the leading attached except for the outside border. Today we're going to be talking about that outside border and a little bit about bias tape and also how I'm going to transfer it to a background that's suitable for a wall hanging. Join us right after this. And welcome back to the Shamrock Quilt Studio. Hi and welcome back. Today we're talking about our stained glass project and I wanted to bring you up to date a little bit on where we are. I have been working on putting the leading on for this project in everything except the very outside of the circle. I wanted to give you a couple of tips. When I first started putting the bias tape on, I was using the applique glue, putting just a few drops to hold it in place. This was the same way that we dealt with the applique on our Miss Kelly project, and it worked really well. But it is a little bit difficult to get those bias tapes to turn unless you add glue at the appropriate places. It just doesn't want to hold it in that nice flowing curve that you want. So I started putting a line of glue on, or just about a line. There were two problems with that. First of all, it was too much glue because the glue would saturate the black bias tape that I had and it would show up on the top. Now it is water-soluble glue, so we can get rid of that. The other thing was that once it dried and set, it was pretty stiff. It was hard to get my needle through it when I was stitching that bias tape on. So you need to find a happy in between a few drops and a line. So you've got enough glue to hold it to keep your curves, but not so much that it causes you problems in your sewing and getting the glue on the fabric. So let's talk about how I resolved the glue issue. Once I had all of this on and sewn down, and when I was sewing it, I didn't worry about the glue because I figured we would be able to get it out one of a couple of ways without washing it. So once it was all done, then I just took a damp white cloth and I would just rub the little areas where the glue showed through. And mostly it showed on the black bias tape. But there were a couple of places that you could see it on the colored fabric as well. I did it once, I let it dry, then I'd look at it again and see where I could see it and do it again. And we've kind of talked about that method before with other things, with the invisible markers or the disappearing ink markers that you use for quilting. So it's the same process. Another thing I wanted to talk about is when you are going to layer these bias tapes on. Say you've got a squiggly line and then it comes another line is on top of it. One of the mistakes that I made was cutting that flowy line too short. I would think, well, the bias tape is going to cover it here, so it doesn't need to be any longer. My advice to you is cut it at least as long as it needs to be to get to the other side of the bias tape. Because when you're sewing that piece on top, you can always retrim it. If it's too short, let me tell you, it's a pain because somehow you've got to take that stitching that you're putting on and stretch that bias tape so that it covers all the area. And if it doesn't cover the area, if you have a section, and I did have one here, where you have to go in and you're essentially making a satin stitch with your thread to cover the area that you did not cover to make it aesthetically pleasing and also make sure that that bias tape does not ravel out on you over time. So those are a couple of tips that I have for you. I also did a little bit of surfing for some other folks who do a lot of work with bias tape. And I found another method that you could use when you are putting your bias tape down, because kind of my thought process even with this was to keep it with the short little pieces. Where did my black fabric go to? There it is. So my pieces that I used were just this long, and that worked great for everything. I had one arc that I didn't have a whole piece and I had to piece it, and I just used my method of folding it over and piecing it. But she has a different method, and we're going to implement that method on this last strip. But we need to get there first. I debated about what size to make it. I can either make it 3/4 of an inch or a full inch, and I'll put those out there so you can see really what the difference is in size. It's not much. The 3/4 inch would be a little easier to work with because it's not as wide, and making those curves will not require as much adjustment and easing to get it to work. I think the 1 inch would be a really bold statement. So after thinking about it very carefully, I think I'm going to go with the 1 inch and give us that bold statement. So we're going to be cutting strips out of this fabric to use as a 1 inch bias tape leading or frame around this round piece. And I wanted to talk a little bit about bias for those who are new to sewing or new to applique or bias tape in general. And I'm sure that this is going to be old news to anyone who's worked with it before, but just very briefly, what is bias? Okay, so you have the selvage edge of your fabric here. It's very straight. If you look at it up to the light, you can see that it's a very densely woven area of the fabric. And generally speaking, it is where the fabric goes into the loom or the machinery that weaves this fabric, and that's what holds it still. Think of it like, what would be a good example? If you were thinking of curtains, the pocket at the top that the rod goes in is kind of like the selvage. It holds it in place while you do what you need to with the rest of the curtain. That's a simple explanation. Then the threads are woven in a cross and long ways design. Like this. That's your selvage. Here are your threads going across, up and down, and back and forth. And when you cut your fabric across, when they cut it in the store for you, they're cutting with the grain or across the grain, depending on how you're doing it or how they're doing it. When you're talking about bias, it's just the opposite. Here's your selvage. Here's your threads going across and up and down, but you're cutting at a diagonal, 45 degree. And what that does is it allows, and I'm hesitant to do it with this, but we will give it a shot. This on the grain stretches very, very little. This on the bias will stretch quite a lot, and it's very pliable, and you're able to form it around circles. It gives either shrinkage or a stretchy outward so that it allows that formation. And that's the magic ingredient in something like we're doing now, or other types of applique, or the binding for quilts that we use bias for. In dressmaking, you might use a bias at a neckline to line the neckline because it stretches and it gives, and you fold it over and it creates a very nice finished edge. So it's very useful. It's a good concept to know. We will be doing a video after the first of the year, or come out after the first of the year, about bias and bindings and the different kinds. So if you're interested in that, join us for that. So we're going to do a 1 inch bias tape around. Now, when we finish this project, It's a beautiful stained glass, and I wanted to show it to you. I think it came out really, really better than even I expected. I wasn't really sure what to expect with this. I figured we'd have some challenges. We had a few small challenges, but for the most part, it's going really well. And I will say that last night when I finished up the stitching on it to this point, it was all drawn up. It was extremely wrinkled. It looked like it would never, ever lay flat. And let me tell you quickly what I did to remedy that. I brought it upstairs and I put fresh water in my steam iron, or you could use fresh water in a spray bottle. And I ironed the back. I started with the back, and I got the backing just as flat as I possibly could. And I ironed it. I didn't press it, I ironed it, because I wanted to stretch all of the threads and the stitching out to relax it, to pull it out. And then I flipped it over to the front and did the same thing with the steam iron. So that allowed it to do a couple of things. One, it got it flat, it stretched it out, and it made it very, very attractive in the way it looks. The steam also has the effect of softening any glue that remained on the outside. So we got that effect as well. And then any glue that was remaining underneath, the steam and not the steam, but the heat would have reattached it. So we kind of doing a couple of things there at the same time. Now, how am I going to move forward? I'm going to take this piece and trim it and put it on my machine and make a stitch, probably 1/4 of an inch, and then maybe 1/2 an inch to the outside of this medallion. And then I'm going to take this medallion and cut it out outside of those stitch marks that I make. And I'm going to place it in the center of a square of this fabric. It's a nice neutral fabric that's really going to make that pop. So that'll be lovely. It's a little stark against the white, and I think the white hanging on the wall is just too much. So we're going to put it on here with a piece of black bias as a border to it, or a frame around it. So it will actually look kind of like a porthole in the wall that's stained glass. And that's how we're going to do that. Now the piece is going to be about 24-25 inches square. I haven't decided if I'm going to quilt it or not. My guess is for the initial phase, I will not. I probably will just iron the edges of the fabric over in the back until I decide what I'm going to do. My goal in this was to demonstrate that we could do stained glass. Stained glass is lovely. I'm not sure how it's really going to look quilted, because quilted gives you that puckery effect, and I'm not sure we want that on this. So for the initial phase of this project, we are not going to quilt it. We may at some time later come back and put a batting and backing on, and maybe do some very loose quilting at that point, but we'll see how that goes. So there we are. I do see a little bit of glue left there, but we can always get that off, and you're going to have little strings popping up from time to time, and those just need to be managed until they stop. But it looks really good. I'm very pleased, and if you're sewing along with us, I hope you're having similar results with yours as well. Don't be discouraged, just keep going, and it will come together for you. Okay, so we've got a game plan on this, and the next time you see it, it's going to be finished and hanging on the wall. If you found this video helpful, please give us a thumbs up and consider subscribing to our channel so you'll see all the updates on this. And if you've missed any part of it, go back and check the playlist, because we started from the beginning where we had just a plain piece of fabric and a bundle of colors that we put together to form this design. Remember, you can do this with other designs as well. Anything you can get a drawing would work for this. Probably the bigger the better to some degree, because it's a little easier to work with the curves and you get a little more definition in what you're doing. But you could do, if you've got the patience, you could do a really small one if you like. So we'll see you next time here at the Shamrock Quilt Studio. Hope you have a great week.